Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Bala, and welcome to day 2 of the breakout sessions. We have a very interesting topic today. We're going to see the intersection of what does product management mean for APIs, some similarities of what you would do, and what are some of the things which are unique to APIs. But before I get into the session, a show of hands, how many of you here actually do product management as a job function? Okay, good. Looks like about 30, 40%. So what we're going to do in the session today is going to be, we'll just walk through some framing of what product management is, what are some of the challenges or uniqueness around APIs, and then we're very excited. We have actually one of our customers of Apigee and Google Cloud, Pitney Bowes here, and we're going to have Jon Spinney kind of talk about how they practice product management for their APIs. And then hopefully we'll have some time for question and answer. So that's the plan. So I thought let's start with the very basic question, what is product management? And I thought I'll ask the tool we all know, which is, what does Google say? So Google came up with a definition which probably is very accurate in some sense, but it's probably not very pragmatic for all the product managers in the room here. They read this and go, I really don't know whether I agree with whatever that's saying. And depending on the day you ask the product manager, they would describe their role as this, or all of these, or some of these, depending on what's happening on that particular day. And all my product manager brothers and sisters here would agree that this is how they feel depending on the day. And I left out some of the other things you might feel here because it's not appropriate on the slide, but you all know what I mean by this, right? So this is where product management is in terms of what you do for any product you might be managing, whether it's a technical product, hardware product, or software product. So if you leave these definitions out and step back for a minute and think about what is it that we're trying to do, it effectively boils down to thinking about the user. And depending on the product, it is all about who is the actual user of your product and how do you really focus all your energy. And when I say all your energy, I mean you and the team with which you're working to produce the product, to focus on that user. In some cases, it's bigger than the user. It is the customer. And that applies to certain segments of products. And in the case of APIs, it's not just the customer, but it's also the developer, right? And that's what we start with when we think about product management for APIs. So for us, the starting point or the constituent who is most important when it comes to product management for APIs is the developer. Now, as you all know, when it comes to product management, there are 3 kind of big aspects out here, right? One is the customer, user, whatever you want to call it, depending on your audience. The second aspect is the technology. And the third one is the business. You, as a product manager, are trying to get these 3 to work in favor so that you can drive growth, drive success, drive adoption, whatever the metric you care deeply about for the success of the mission you're on. But if you really distill down these 3 things into what exactly you're trying to achieve for each one of these constituents, it boils down to delighting the customer, driving innovation with technology, and last but not the least, driving business impact. That's it. And you can measure this 100 different ways based on your business, the metrics you can track, metrics you can't track, the instrumentation you have in the product or not. But at the end of the day, if you don't have a delighted user or a customer, and if you're not able to deliver very good technical insight and unique value proposition for your customers using technology, and last but not the least, if you're not able to drive actual impact for your business, it doesn't matter. As a product manager, we all fail if those things don't happen. And it's kind of on us. And the kind of good news, bad news here is we are kind of accountable for this. That's a good news. The bad news is you may not have all the responsibility or you may not have all the empowerment you need to sometimes get through this. right? And that's what makes all the product management jobs very interesting and challenging if you're up for it. So when we think about APIs, how do we frame this delight, innovation, and impact in a different way for APIs? Well, we start with the notion of actually the digital value chain. And some of you attended the previous sessions, either where we talked about Apogee products or otherwise, have seen this time and again. And the reason we keep using this framework is it actually drives home the point of what we care deeply about when it comes to APIs, and it distills the point of view that who the audience or the user for your product is. If your product is the API, the user is your developer. So this digital value chain makes that point very, very clear to you. And the good news here is when you're thinking about the API, depending on where you are, either you're providing the product for the API product team, or the API team in this case, or it's a consuming developer who's on the right side of on the screen for you, that person or that user defines what is success looking like for your APIs. Now, whenever I talk about API and the developer being the user, we also go with the notion that the APIs are effectively your company's contract with the developer, right? But it expands from there because the API itself can be used in multiple ways. So let's look at the 3 typical ways we think about the APIs when it comes to that contract. Number 1 is what we call API as a service. And this is very important in a large organization, and some of you probably attended one of my colleagues' session, Ed Anuff, who talked about the overall API-first approach in distributed computing. This is the premise for a lot of the modern application development today, where API is the service that you're providing. And the reason you're providing that is you have developers who you're not going to meet and who would use your service and consume it via the API and build something interesting. And you need to make sure that they have the most frictionless way to build things, and they are only seeing it as a service. And for them, it's they consume the service, build something, and move on. And you're going to make sure that their life is really easy when it comes to providing that API, making it easy for them to discover it, making it easy for them to access it. And the more people in the organization build the APIs as a service, the overall organization can move forward in whatever innovation they want to do with the least amount of friction. And this is something we're starting to see even more now that modern application development is happening, microservices is taking off, people are doing interesting workloads and building containerized applications. This becomes even more important because you want this kind of flourishing innovation to happen when people are using API as a service. Now, in this, you can almost take the view that your internal developers, your own teams, are the customers. And this is a kind of slightly harder shift for a lot of enterprises, especially, because they are so used to having one-on-one integration or one-on-one agreement within teams to build something, which can be sometimes very brittle, to go from there to something which is much more scalable when it comes to an API as a service. But once you have this, then you're ready for the next step. And the next step is what we call as APIs as interaction. Now, but show of hands, for example, how many of you use YouTube or Netflix for viewing content? Most of you, right? Now, the good news is that you probably are viewing that content in different devices all the time. On the laptop, on your mobile device, on an Xbox, on a Chromecast. Every different device, you're watching the same content and interacting with that content. And we have seen people use the API as what we call experience APIs to improve that part of interaction. And Netflix at some point really did this well, where they would have actually APIs based on the device or based on how you're consuming the actual content, the experience would change. And that doesn't mean that they're going and rewriting a bunch of applications or APIs which are being used to expose some of the services, but they actually change the APIs on the consumption side, which is purely to drive the differential experience and create the right interaction for you on the right device. And that's how you're able to scale to over 300 devices, for example, in their case, and still have the right level of interaction and right level of experience for you as a consumer when it comes to that service. Now, for that to happen, Somebody had to think about the API as an experience or an interaction API, and that was the product. And if that product was not there, the developer would not be able to deliver the interaction or the experience you actually were so familiar with when you click play and watch something, and you felt like, wow, this is so good. And you didn't care about whether the device was a tablet or a phone or a laptop. And that's what happened when somebody was able to deliver APIs as interactions for you. So that's kind of the second level. The third level is where we take this one notch up and actually really think about APIs as products, right? So the notion of products immediately kind of brings a very specific image in your head, which is that means there is a packaging, there is something around pricing, and there is something around how you actually deliver this to people. And these are the aspects Jon is going to talk later, but at the core of this is effectively how do you start to think about APIs as a product? Now, if you think about APIs as a product, then each one of you who are playing a product manager role for whatever products you're doing, you have to start thinking about even these APIs as your products, right? So let's say, for example, one of you in the audience here has a software product, right? And I meet a lot of customers who have actually a software product, and they're trying to build an ecosystem around it. So the one set of PMs are really driving the product itself. As to how do we deliver the product, and our users can use it, and then we measure, improve, and drive the business impact. Awesome. There's a set of PMs then who are thinking about how do I take this and deliver value with my partners? And for them to do interesting integration and experiences and interactions, the only thing this PM has to offer is an API. That's the starting point. So now if I'm an ecosystem PM, and if I'm doing something interesting with a partner, and I'm building some interactions, I have to start treating the API as my product. What does that mean? So first and foremost, it has to be a first-class citizen in your product portfolio. So why do I say that? It cannot be, oh, we have a product, you were trying to run a partner program, let's figure out, okay, we'll come up with some API. No. You got to treat that API as a first-class product, as if your systems went down and a customer is going to scream, you have to apply the same rigor when the API goes down and your partner is going to actually fail in delivering something. So you have to treat it with that level of care. But before even you get to delivering that API with that level of care, you have to start with the notion that we need a great API. And if that API has to be great, what are the characteristics for that? Why should a developer use that API? What is unique about that API? How would I go and make this API really frictionless for a developer? Those are the kind of things you got to think about before you actually have an API. Now, here's the interesting piece. For all the good software products out there, hopefully there is an API already used to build that product. And then the question is, how do you really make that available to somebody outside for certain functionality or certain aspects of the product which can be used for integration or doing some ecosystem work? But if you don't have that API, you've got to go back and figure out how do you create that API. But you're thinking about it more like a product, as in you're looking at the user, you're thinking about their requirements, what do they need, what is the service level you need to provide for them, and then more importantly, how do I deliver this to them in a frictionless manner? So that's kind of the starting point of creating that API and delivering it to your developers. The second one is once you have that API, it is not done. Because like any other software product or any other product you product manage, you're constantly learning and you're improving. That means you're looking at data, you're looking at feedback, and you're figuring out where are the bottlenecks, where could we do interesting things with this particular API, and what can I do better so that my partner or my ecosystem folks can do something more interesting going forward and innovate on top of my product. So that comes to really thinking about instrumentation, measurement, and refinement as you go with the release of the API. So this is what we call, it's not about the launch of the API, it is almost thinking about the life cycle of the API so that you're measuring, looking at the data, and improving what needs to happen with that particular API. The third one is, of course, the impact piece, right? Which is that it's all great. You have an API, you have a good way to learn and improve. You're probably onto version 3 of the API. So you went from a kind of a beta program to a proper GA, and now you're in version 3, which should be the most mature way for people to actually access your systems or software and build something interesting. But the third one is impact. is that particular API really driving any value and impact for you and your customers, more importantly? Because remember, if you have a product which has both a software product and an API, you're looking at two sides of the coin when it comes to a business. You can keep selling more software, and or you can also drive innovation and experience through your APIs, and that can actually accrue benefit back into the product. Or both can go independently, and they suddenly become two streams of businesses. These all depend on what you're doing and what area or what domain you are in and how it happens, right? But at the end of the day, there has to be an impact measurement. And this impact measurement can be sometimes very fuzzy because you can start with the premise that I'm going to generate a lot of revenue from this particular API. So I have customers who always come and say, we have a core business that's growing very well. We're happy with it. We want to do this API program because we want to unlock a whole new set of revenue. Well, great. But the challenge is the API itself does not generate revenue. You got to invest in it like you do for any other go-to-market, because now you have API as a product. How are you going to take it to market? Who are your customers? How are you going to make sure there's demand for that? How are you going to make sure there's awareness for that? How are you going to convert that? How are you going to then monetize that API to drive revenue if that's the goal you have? So that's one of the things you got to think through is when you think about impact, you're also thinking about how do I take this API to market to drive that impact? The second notion is that you have no revenue attachment whatsoever to this API, but it's a fantastic way to build loyalty and stickiness to the platform, right? And we've seen examples of this over and over again, right? Whether you take a very simple example like what Slack does today or Google Maps API does today, is that the API itself may or may not generate the revenue, but the integration it allows you to do, the experience it creates, makes people keep using the product. And that is gold, because at the end of the day, what you want is people to continue to use your core product, and the APIs become a way to kind of fan out, if you may, and bring in more audiences, bring in more partners who can build stuff on it. And when you really get to the scale where a lot of people are building on top of your product, and that's when you can really start to think about yourself as a platform. And that gets really interesting, and then you really don't care about monetizing one particular aspect, because now you have certainly a lot of opportunity to think about monetization in a very different way. So the core of this, when you think about API products, it goes back to those three things, right? Number one, you got to treat this as a product, and that means you got to pay attention to what are you delivering in a unique value proposition to a customer or a user of that particular product, which is your API. Number two, you got to think about how you're going to constantly learn, look at the data, keep improving and innovating on top of that, so you don't stop as soon as you release the first version of the API. Just like you wouldn't stop releasing your first version of software, or one model of a car, or one model of a white good product, or one particular SKU of a soap, or anything else. You got to constantly look at the data and improve and move forward from there. And the last one is really think about it in terms of what is the real impact measurement out here? Are you measuring revenue? Are you measuring the value back to your core product? And how do you nurture that and not imagine that just because you have an API, suddenly things are going to magically appear? It takes a lot of effort to take that API as a product to the market, just like you spent a lot of energy taking something else to the market in terms of your product. So when you think about those aspects, that's where we really think about we have to treat the API as a product in this new economy, or digital economy, if I can say that. And that's where a lot of you, as a product manager, especially if you're looking at anything which has remotely to do with technology, you got to think about having an API. You also have to think about even other products which can have APIs. I mean, we have customers who do anything from financial transaction to logistics to data to sometimes even IoT devices. All of these things have APIs. And they're trying to build something around it, and APIs become a way or means to deliver that value differently to different users. And some of them do it in a platform sense, some of them do it in a product sense, some of them do it in an interaction or in terms of service sense. So hopefully, I've given you a very basic but important framework to think through how you can go from API as a service to APIs for interactions to API as a product, and what are some of the key principles around building APIs as products. Now, that's the framework. That's a good theoretical framework for all of you to have in your head. But it's always fun when you have somebody who's practicing this and they can share what they have learned and how they think about this in real life. So to do that, I'm going to welcome Jon. Jon Spinney heads up API products for Pitney Bowes, and he's going to come and share some of his learning. Please welcome Jon.
Thanks, appreciate it. That was fantastic in terms of those 3 pillars. So I'm Jon Spinney from Pitney Bowes. A little bit about us. We're almost a 100-year-old company. We work across a variety of different lines of business. We do identity management, location, things like that. We process a lot of transactions on a daily basis, billions across what we call a borderless world of commerce. I sometimes think about the role a lot and spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about it. And an API in and of itself is, I kind of think of as like an access method to things that we have and have had for a long time. And one of the comments that's really resonated with me, especially at this conference, has been the transition from, we're in the midst of lifting and shifting. We've had customers for a long time that have been using products that have had APIs available from them, and they can latch onto those things. But we started a digital transformation journey a couple years ago where we wanted to introduce APIs as products available as a service. And that was a new thing for the company. And we encountered all of the typical challenges that someone going through a digital transformation shift goes through. And I sometimes think of introducing these kinds of products as the other 80%. Once you have the API, what is all the other 80% of the things that you have to do in order to operationalize it and turn it into a product? And I'll talk about some of those things here in a second. So when we started looking at how we would do this to help an existing incumbent customer base, as well as go out and find net new customers to consume APIs, to Bala's point, we put people first, customers, users. But by people, I mean ultimately the people who are going to either use these APIs or their partners in business or finance who are helping them purchase and bring in these APIs into their organization. But we've had folks in telecommunications and insurance and financial services and other industries use our software that's been on premise for years and years and years. And there have been APIs available from that. But what we found, I'll give you a real example, a customer that we've been doing business with for a few decades has been using our stuff on premise that entire time. And there was a new product team inside that company, and they specialize in home security, that discovered our self-service APIs on their own through a paid search campaign that we ran. And that team had no idea that their company had been doing business with us for that amount of time. They discovered a new way to consume things that we've provided for a number of years, but in a delivery vehicle or a consumption pattern that they're used to. And that was a recent discovery. But when we first started our journey towards digital transformation, we had some hypotheses about what people needed. We've since learned about that. But originally, it was what we discovered was let's focus on the people first and what their needs are, which can help us determine how we price things, which then informs how we build our product, which then informs how we build our back office and all of the supporting infrastructure to support it. It seems almost irrational sometimes as a product person. We have a tendency, I think, sometimes, as product people, we have a tendency sometimes to put our products before other things because we get so excited about our own products. But if we apply a discipline where we put people first, price can then follow, product can follow thereafter, and then the back office infrastructure to support your product, all of the things that you need to have in terms of operations and sales and lead generation and fulfillment and provisioning and activation and billing and the other 80%. It starts to define itself for you, which is a magical thing. We certainly didn't stumble upon it that way. So when we started with people, we went out and talked to our existing customer base, and what we had found was two types of classifications or archetypes. One was a commercial developer, and the other was a corporate developer. And we came up with those terms on our own. But basically, when we looked at all of our customers, we found some customers that were using our products on premise for a long time to build other products that they sold. And then we also found types of customers that were more corporate in nature. They were using our products on premise to solve an internal business problem or a workflow to gain some efficiencies. So one was sort of on the side of generating revenue, the other was on the side of saving money. In reality, what we found, though, is that we're now talking to a lot of product managers on the commercial side. So we're having product manager to product manager conversations with companies that want to consume APIs, where you have product people doing assessments and evaluations and working with their developers at the same time to decide what APIs make sense in order to augment or enhance their product. So we've landed on these types of personas, these two users or customers that we now see a pattern for in the 2-year journey that we've been on through digital transformation. And so Janet is what we used to call a commercial developer. We now have learned that we're working more with, rather than developers, we're working with product managers where developers are testing things out, but then we have financial buyers in the product management organization. And again, her interests are she's seeking a service to augment or enhance her existing product or solution that she sells in the marketplace. Whereas Dario, what we used to classify as kind of a corporate developer, we found is now more like a business process-oriented kind of person inside a large corporation that could work in any department across that organization. So like take a telecommunications provider, for example, and there's a real estate department, there's an engineering department, there's an operations department, and there's a retail department, and so forth and so forth. We found lots of folks like that have business process and workflow problems that they need to solve, where our APIs as an ingredient to that overall workflow and business process is helping them achieve the efficiencies and gains that they want to find and making them more streamlined in their organization. Janet and Dario, when we set out on this journey, in talking to them, we found out that they had some common goals, despite their differences in objectives in terms of generating revenue or saving money. And those common goals were they're performance-based, whatever they were essentially measured upon in terms of their own individual performance. Those were different. However, their must-haves and their must-not-haves were identical. It was really kind of interesting when we were sampling the community in order to define these. And some of the must-haves are kind of obvious things. Simple, easy self-service learn experiences, well-documented documentation, simple checkout flows and learning and buying, these kinds of things. They both shared these. They both shared a desire to have a frictionless self-service kind of experience where they can learn about the product themselves. They could buy the product with little interaction, or at least low friction, get their access keys and their secrets, get started, use the product, buy the product, and get support for the product all in one central destination. And those common goals were what we set out to go and achieve. So we made a promise to ourselves and to all of our customers that was what we were going to go and do. It seems simple enough on the surface, but actually there's a lot of stuff in there. How they learn about it required us to work across multiple different teams inside our company to market appropriately and message the right way. How they bought it, we were forced to adjust our billing practices. How they got it forced us to change how we communicated. We had to send automated notifications and emails about where they go, and then where did they go from there. And we had all these back office systems that each did those in silos And we had to bring all those together. So as an organization, it was very challenging for us, but we knew we needed to deliver this promise. And then the things around usage and payments were also really were challenging. One of the key things we found was that when we were working with over the years we were working with our incumbent customers, they said, "We love your products, but we really don't like your process. It takes a really long time for us to get to use your stuff. We've got to go through this difficult contracting thing where our lawyers are going back and forth on things, where we have to set up and create custom provisions, and your bills, I get 3 different or 4 different bills from you, and I'm not sure which product it's for because we have so many products inside the company." So one of the key things we set out to go and do was deliver unified contracting and billing. And that enabled us to actually deliver this promise because the rest of it sort of fell into place around the marketing and learn aspects, buying and getting, using and paying and so forth. But before we got there, one of the key challenges that we had was not only the complexity of the number of products that we had, but also the variety and the diversity and the variable value associated with that. So pretty simple to say to yourself, okay, the customer says they only want 1 bill from me and 1 contract. But how do I do that for a myriad of products that all have different value, maybe different usage restrictions, things like that, that we have to think about from a business perspective? So as an example of that complexity, one of our lines of business is location intelligence, and within that, we've been assembling data sets for a number of years, and we've got a tremendous amount of data. Each one of these data sets is different. It has a distinctive value. It has a distinctive price. And if you opened up like our old school on-premise beige book or price book, it's like 800 pages long. And we can't give that to a customer that's expecting the frictionless kind of self-service experience that they'd want from a modern API product. So that was one complexity around the breadth that we had, and we needed to abstract that. The other was around variety. We've got all these different types of data, and describing the value has always been a challenge, but as we moved to more of a self-service delivery model, it became increasingly painful for us to learn that we needed to find a way really to abstract away this complexity and deliver on our promise of self-service simplicity across all stages of the journey that the customer was going to go through. And then at the same time, there was some additional complications or complexity added in around the verticals that we serve. So there was very vertical specific messaging that we needed to do, and so forth. So as we started thinking about this, and we started shopping around for partners to help, it took a while, but we went from a messy situation where we had a lot of different data with different values, with different messages that seemed overwhelming from a product manager standpoint in order to position and market effectively and help people understand without lengthy conversations and so forth, some of the must-not-haves that Dario and Janet shared, to move to more of a model that made sense. So we that abstracted away all that complexity. So we looked at 2 things. We looked at the Chinese menu of all of our products in that beige book that I mentioned, where you could have dozens of categories with dozens of prices within each category, and you buy those things a la carte, which means you get multiple bills and multiple contracts because each one of those data have their own usage restrictions, have their own acceptable use policies, have their own prices, usually their own legal terms, all that sort of stuff, to more of a carnival model. So when you go to how many of you have been to a carnival before? Okay. So when you go to a carnival, you buy a roll of tickets at the door. That's your bill and that's your contract. And then you go inside the carnival and you spend your tickets on different rides or goods or services. And so one ride might cost 10 tickets, another might cost 5, another might cost 3 or 2 or 1 or something like that. But we took a tip from that playbook and said, let's apply that to the complexity that we have around variable valued products and how we price them. So what we thought was, okay, if we open up a store for APIs, when they come in, let's let them sign that one contract that covers all the APIs, and then get their roll of tickets that they can then go and spend in any way that they would like on any and all APIs that we have at that store. So that's what we did. In working with Apogee, we were able to introduce one virtual currency, which we don't call tickets in Carnival, we call them credits. And you can buy these credits either up front or you can pay as you go. So there's both prepaid and postpaid options. There's one unified contract and there's one unified bill. And those were the common two must-haves that had the most pain for both Janet and Dario, that we went to set out and go deliver on or deliver against in terms of our promise that we wanted to give all of our customers. We started, when we did this, it was really important for us to do that unified billing and contracting because we wanted to do everything self-service, because we'd never done that before. And selling on-premise over the years, we were pretty good at selling up-market, but once we got into the mid-market and the down-market where folks wanted to do things on their own, it became difficult. But through the self-service delivery, we essentially came up with prepackaged plans that allowed us to automatically provision our monitoring systems for transactions that were being used, automate billing, automate contracting, all of the things that reduced the friction that made it complex, and we removed the comments like, we love your products, but we hate your process. So we've really fixed the process, which I call the other 80%. And we did it specifically for self-service. Now, that said, what we've found is that self-service in and of itself requires all those things that Bala mentioned in terms of iterating and capturing metrics on how you're engaging, retention marketing things. So like once they sign up and you collect that sign-up data, you're putting that somewhere, and then you're monitoring their transactions. Are they active or are they inactive? If they're inactive, what's your campaign? What's your outreach strategy? If they're active, what's your outreach strategy? Who do you assign to that? How do you do fulfillment and follow-up? How do you get them to upgrade or downgrade? Do you let them swap out their cards? All those kinds of things that are in the other 80% that we have to think about as product people, or else we're going to end up on the phone handling all the customer support escalations, which none of us want to do. So we get it right the first time. But that said, that was my plan. And I thought that self-service would work. And what we found is that we had a gap in several areas of the business where we still know we need to improve, particularly around retention and communicating and opening up a two-way dialect and channel that's digital. We're still going to continue to work on that, but as a result of what we learned from the self-service channel that we opened, we've decided to go back to using our direct sellers who've been selling on-premise for so long to come and now sell these self-service things as well. So I guess the point of that story is that we all sometimes have a vision at the origin, or the beginning of where we start, and the journey takes us in a variety of different directions, and we persevere and we pivot. We've recently gone through a pivot change, but all of this we couldn't have done without Google's help. And I mentioned that point around the direct sales stuff because it's going to introduce a whole nother set of complications that are different from the way that we set up self-service. And they're going to be things like, how do you set up custom plans and then provision those and create custom bills, and things like that. So there was another session track, I think earlier today, about how that's going to be done going forward. And Google's made another acquisition in that area. So we're pretty stoked about that too, because we know that that's an entirely set of new complications that are right in front of us. In fact, we're seeing that now. So, thank you. Thanks.
So I always find it fascinating when you have customers like this talk about this for a couple of reasons, right? Number one, especially being in the Bay Area and Silicon Valley, you get used to fairly uh, cutting edge technology, cutting edge businesses which are built like over the last 10 years or 5 years. And the speed at which you can innovate and do interesting things is very different. And then to see, a company like Pitney Bowes, who's built a business over the last 100 years, I guess,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
And then trying to do the shift with all the importance of the existing business while trying to shift and create a new way to do the business, that's the challenge. That's really the challenge. Because if all of us product managers had a clean sheet and we could go build a product, it's become so much more easier. But all of us live in a real world where we have to deal with constraints, which are our existing business constraints. And sometimes what happens is the constraint is money. Like you can't just go to town because you don't have the money to go market, raise awareness. And sometimes we don't have the right product features. And one thing, none of us have enough engineers in our engineering teams ever, right? So all these constraints happen to all of us. So the question is, how do we do the right thing in terms of opening up and driving the business and then innovating as we go forward? So hopefully you got some real, unfiltered feedback here from Jon. And I kind of requested him not to kind of paint necessarily a rosy picture, nor a very dire picture, but a real picture so that all of you can take away the right things and think about how it impacts your business. I almost felt, Jon, that your talk could land up in this classic meme where you have what I think I do versus what my mom thinks I do, and what really happens kind of thing. I think you could do some version of that. But to wrap it up here, so what are we going to just kind of reinforce what we've been telling, I think, through the session. Number one is, if you're an API product manager and you're thinking about API product management, absolutely focus on your developer personas. And I'm calling them developer personas because Jon correctly pointed out, sometimes these are product manager kind of people on the other side. Mm-hmm. Sometimes these are actual developers. It depends on your business and what kind of APIs you have. The second one, I think, which is loud and clear, and I'll say it once again, is please make things easy to access and discover. I cannot insist on this more, because the one thing I think everybody's getting used to is going and searching or discovering things themselves before they actually want to talk to somebody. And if you're not surfacing in the way they want to consume your information upfront, you lose them way before. So please, please make sure that it's available very easily. And the reason you have a developer.pitneybowes.com or any of the other sites, and make sure it's indexed, make sure it's available on search, is that you are going to find people doing exactly what you do when you're going to buy a gift for your partner or spouse or your kid. You go and search. And everybody does that. And you've got to make sure that your product is discoverable, and then from there, it's easily accessible, and APIs are no different. The last one is, please remember to deliver a consistent experience. And when I say consistent, I'm not suggesting that you deliver a white glove experience. There's a difference, right? There are products for which you need a white glove experience. But consistency means every time I interact with you, I know what I'm going to get back. So as long as that is there, I'm okay with it, right? So, but if, like Jon was saying, if I go for location intelligence API and I get one experience, and I go to something else and I get a different experience, I'm going, this is the same company? Come on, what's happening here? So it is not about the high touch or low touch aspect of it. It's about the consistency of the experience you want to deliver to your developers. That's the most important thing. Because that brings people back and they know what to expect. They are more productive. You can then improve, and every time you improve, they can see that you're making a change, which is consistent as well. Okay? Thank you again for your time, and Jon and I will be around for any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you.